Hello, my brood. Welcome back. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about emotional pain. Before we get going, though, I just want to remind everybody that I'm not a mental health expert, I'm not a doctor. This is just me talking from my own interest and experience and personal research. You shouldn't take any of this as medical or professional advice. I think that when it comes to emotional pain, most people struggle to understand it in a very practical sense. So let's step back and talk briefly about physical pain first. We all know what it's like to stub your toe. We all know what it's like to bump into something particularly hard or hit our head. We've all had these sorts of experiences. But let's use the stub your toe example. When you're walking along and you're paying attention to something else and you slam your toe into maybe a dresser, maybe a box, you're met with this very sudden pain that is nearly instantaneous. That is very shortly followed, about a second or two later, by a dull pain that seems to go on and on and on. And these two separate pains aren't an accident. The pain signals are actually being sent by two separate pathways in your body. The sudden and immediate pains are being sent by A delta fibers. A delta fibers are very, very fast at getting pain signals to your brain. That slower pain that comes along a second or two later are being sent by C fibers. C fibers are much slower and they're responsible for that ongoing sensation that you have. This might seem a little unusual at first when we wonder why there's a fast acting and a slow acting pathway for pain. Why not just have one or the other? But let's consider what would happen if we only had one of each. If we only had the C fibers, the ones that give us that dull pain that keeps going, then if we did something like put our hand on a hot surface, our hand would be there for a second or 2 seconds before those pain signals hit our brain. And by the time that we realize we need to move our hand, we may have done very severe, maybe even irreversible damage. On the other hand, if we only had the A delta fibers, when we touch that hot surface, we'll pull our hand back very quickly, but the pain will pass. As you might remember if you've stubbed your toe recently, that sharp pain that you get is very momentary. It doesn't last for very long. So if you touched the hot surface and all you had was a momentary sharp pain, you might not be as dissuaded from touching that hot surface again. See, us humans, we very much so depend on conditioning, which is really just a form of learning. When a momentary bad thing happens, it quickly exits your brain. But when that momentary bad thing turns into a long running dull thing, it's a little easier for that to stick in your brain. And so, very quickly, probably even just after one instance, you'll learn that you don't want to do that again. So, let's come back and talk about emotional pain now. This isn't necessarily a one to one comparison, but I think that it gives us a good analogy to work with. When something bad happens, we might feel this immediate surge of, oh my God, Maybe you do something embarrassing. Maybe you slip and fall in front of a group of people, or maybe you have a Freudian slip and use the wrong word in an embarrassing way, and you get this big shock of, I can't believe that just happened. And then that feeling sits around with you for maybe minutes, maybe hours, maybe days, and you start thinking on it and you think, oh, I can't believe I did that. Why did I do that? Even sometimes this feeling can show up years later. We think back to maybe an embarrassing thing that we did when we were in high school, or maybe something that we said to a family member that was just completely off track. And that feeling, that sensation of embarrassment suddenly comes back to us. But similarly to the A delta fibers and C fibers, with the near instantaneous and slow response, we end up having both a sudden emotional response and one that runs much longer. This, I think, comes at an evolutionary advantage as well. We often like to think of ourselves as independent people, or maybe we've had it worked into us that independence is the goal. But humans and many species are very dependent on each other. We're dependent on each other for food. We're dependent on each other for things like our electricity or for our travel between places. We're dependent on each other for individual unique skills in today's world, individual computing skills or accounting skills. But historically, you might be dependent on someone to provide protection, or perhaps you're dependent on someone to gather firewood. There are many, many things that we find ourselves as a species dependent on, and that's only the foundational layer of it. After you've met your fundamental needs, we still have social needs. We have needs to be included. We have needs to feel loved. We have needs to feel better about ourselves and to ascend in the way that we can be the best versions of ourselves. And so, this emotional response, both immediate and long running, do contribute towards us being dependent on the others. You can imagine that if when you did something embarrassing or maybe that annoyed people and you only felt bad about it for a moment, that you might not learn quickly that it was disadvantageous to you to continue exploiting that. So it would be easy for people to exclude you from the group, or it would be easy to lose friends and not realize why. And this wouldn't just be an autistic problem at this point or a socially awkward problem. This would now become a wide societal problem. It is beneficial to us to have negative feelings because it helps us find our way in difficult situations. But of course, when some of us feel bad for a long, long time, or we have a disproportionately large negative feeling emerge, whereas maybe someone else might feel bad, we'll say the normal amount, it can cause us some problems. This is similar to physical pain as well. You might have that friend who they stub their toe and they gently say, ow. But if you did the same thing, it would be serious upset. Or maybe you're that friend who has a very high pain tolerance. Just similarly, some people will become embarrassed or annoyed or angry, and it will be very gentle. Other people, it will be very intense. And for some of us, it can be very, very long running. Perhaps you have rejection sensitivity, and someone tells you, no, I don't feel like coming over and visiting you tonight. The normal response to that would be, okay, well, maybe we'll hang out again next weekend. But for someone with rejection sensitivity, that may be a very big, scary, immediate response, followed by a long period of rumination. Obviously, this is where it can become harmful. So, I don't want to suggest that all pain is good pain. What I'm trying to convey as a message is that your pain, your emotions, your feelings, these are natural things. You don't have to feel ashamed for having those feelings. You don't have to feel ashamed because you reacted in a different way than someone else. You're allowed to have these things because they are a fundamental part of being a human. Being disproportionately upset, or maybe upset about individual things, or maybe confused about your emotions, or ruminating on things, it's not an autistic thing. That's not a neurodivergent thing. That's a human thing. It just tends to be that we feel them in a little bit of a different way than most people do. Hopefully, on a future episode of the Autistic Brood, we'll get into a little bit on how to help bring those pains down to a tolerable level. But for now, I just want you to remember your feelings, your emotions are valid. You're allowed to have them. What you do with them, we'll talk about that on a future day.